All right, let's begin the journey. Close your eyes and let the world slow down. It was a quiet night, much like any other, and yet something in the air felt different. The kind of night where time feels thick, like honey dripping from a spoon, where silence wraps around everything like a soft, warm blanket. The kind of night that whispers stories from far away, stories buried beneath time, beneath water, beneath memory. And tonight, I'll tell you one of those stories. Far back, over 100 years ago, a dream took shape, not the kind of dream that lives in the mind alone, but one that was built with steel, sweat, and hope. A ship, a ship so grand, so vast, so dazzling, they called her unsinkable. She was the Titanic, a name that would echo through time, not because she was mighty, but because she was fragile. Like all things we dare to believe will last forever. The story of Titanic doesn't begin in the ocean. It begins in hearts, in the hopes of those who built her, and in the hearts of those who climbed aboard her decks, unaware that they were stepping into history, into legend, into something far bigger than themselves. Imagine now the scent of fresh wood and paint, the clang of tools against iron, the low hum of industry and ambition as men in Belfast labored day and night, crafting something they believed would defy nature itself. She was called the Ship of Dreams because she carried the dreams of so many, the rich, hoping to journey in luxury, the poor, hoping to begin a new life in America, and the crew, hoping for something steady, something grand, something to be proud of. Each bolt, each beam, each staircase, placed with care, with pride, with something tender behind the work, a belief that this ship was more than steel and wood, that she was proof of human greatness, that she was destiny floating on the sea. When Titanic was ready, she was breathtaking, longer than any structure afloat. Her decks stretched like open streets in the sky, her rooms filled with chandeliers, velvet seats, pianos, golden doorknobs. She was more than a vessel. She was a palace. And when she left Southampton on that April morning in 1912, there was laughter, there were waving handkerchiefs, hopeful eyes looking out from railings, children pointing at the sea, elderly couples leaning into one another, strangers brushing shoulders for the first time. The water around her sparkled, the sky a soft gray, the wind just enough to ruffle a collar or lift a ribbon. No one knew, no one ever does. As she glided forward, people spoke of her beauty, of her promise, of how nothing could touch her, and perhaps in that was her quiet tragedy. For what is more delicate than a dream that believes itself invincible? On board were thousands of souls, each carrying their own little world inside them. A mother cradling her baby, a young man with a letter in his pocket, a girl with wide eyes and a ribbon in her hair, a worker from steerage clutching a suitcase filled with everything he had. They walked the decks, they dined beneath crystal chandeliers, they shared stories in lounges, whispered promises in the corridors, wrote postcards that would never reach their homes. But in those early days, it was joy, just joy. The ship moved like a floating city, majestic, steady, alive. There were musicians playing gentle tunes, footsteps echoing down long halls, and the quiet clink of fine china. And above them, always, the sea, stretching endlessly, deep, calm, secretive. In the darkness, as the nights passed, some would lean on the railings and stare at the stars. They twinkled like tiny wishes above, and the sea reflected every one of them like a second sky, rippling gently, and yet, in all that beauty, a hush hung beneath, something no one could name, like the silence before a storm, like a breath held too long, because all stories, even the beautiful ones, carry sorrow somewhere inside them, and the Titanic, for all her glory, carried a sorrow the world would never forget. But not yet, not now. Right now she is still sailing, still carrying dreams, still echoing with footsteps, music, and soft conversations, still alive in her own moment of grace. And for now, that's where we'll stay, floating gently with her in this soft, quiet moment before everything begins to change. Just breathe and rest in this pause of time. The days aboard Titanic drifted by like slow-moving clouds, soft, calm, and filled with promise. The sea around her remained gentle, obedient, as if even the ocean respected the majesty of what had been built. To those on board, it felt as though nothing could ever go wrong. There was too much laughter, too much beauty, too much future. In first class, women wore gowns that shimmered like starlight, their gloves perfectly fitted, their hats carefully pinned. Men sipped brandy and spoke of business and power, but with a lightness that only wealth can bring. They played cards, discussed opera, and dined beneath domed ceilings lit with soft yellow glow. In second class, the mood was gentler. Families held hands as they strolled the decks. Writers scribbled in journals, lovers shared stories, children pressed their faces against the glass to glimpse the never-ending sea. There was pride in being aboard, even if not among the elite, for the Titanic made everyone feel important. And down in third class, steerage, there was a hum of hope, a kind of quiet courage, the kind that lives in those who leave everything behind in search of something better. They shared bunks and meals and stories. Many had never seen anything like this ship. To them, it was a miracle. of a vessel, one that would carry them not just to America, but into a new chapter of life. But it was in the quieter moments that Titanic revealed her deepest charm. Late at night, when the ship was hushed and most were asleep, the engines below still murmured gently, and the ship hummed a lullaby, a rhythm that rocked the whole vessel like a cradle. Sometimes a steward would pass softly through the corridor, his footsteps padded, almost ghost-like. Sometimes a girl would sneak out onto the deck, wrapping herself in a shawl just to breathe in the night. And sometimes, just sometimes, two strangers might pass each other, eyes meeting for the briefest moment, the beginning of a story that would never be written. Up above, the stars had never looked so close. The sky stretched infinitely, pinpricked with light, and the sea reflected everyone. So it felt as though the ship floated not on water, but through the middle of the heavens. Time moved slowly here. There was no rush, only the soft thrum of the ship, the creak of wood, and the rustle of dresses, curtains, newspapers turning. One man, an older gentleman with silver hair and quiet eyes, sat by the window each evening. He wasn't waiting for anything, just watching, as though trying to soak in every moment, as though he sensed the world would never feel quite like this again. There was a young boy, too, freckles scattered across his nose like confetti, a cap too big for his head, and a grin that made strangers smile without meaning to. He ran along the deck with his sister, pretending to be the captain of the sea, yelling, "Full steam ahead," while she giggled behind him, her braid flying. There were young couples leaning in close, hands brushing just slightly, the thrill of first love blooming in the salt-kissed air. And everywhere, stories, so many stories, some just beginning, some already nearing their end, all of them woven into this one great voyage. But among it all, perhaps the most beautiful thing was the silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that holds something sacred, the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket, the kind that says, "You are safe here, for now," and yet, far below, in the cold depths of the North Atlantic, an iceberg drifted silently, carved by time, shaped by storms, indifferent to dreams. It waited, not with intention, but simply as part of nature, still, unmoving, invisible in the moonless dark. And above it, Titanic sailed onward, carrying laughter, letters, secrets, and songs, the hearts of so many, each beating its own rhythm, unaware of how near time was to changing. But not yet, not just yet. For now, let's stay in this stillness. Let's walk the decks once more, feel the soft night breeze, hear the distant music from the grand saloon, and let it all be just as it was before everything tilted, before the world remembered her name, not for glory, but for sorrow. The night of April 14th had settled in like a velvet curtain, deep and dark, with the sky so clear it seemed to stretch forever. The stars above twinkled cold and sharp, and the sea was unusually calm, too calm. No wind, no waves, just stillness, like the ocean was holding its breath. Up on the bridge, officers kept watch. Sharp eyes scanned the black horizon. Though without moonlight, even shadows struggled to show themselves. The cold had crept in, quietly but firmly, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones before you realize it's there. And somewhere in that darkness, the iceberg waited. Below, the ship remained alive with its quiet rhythm. A late dinner, a card game wrapping up, laughter from a group of men in the smoking room, a steward folding napkins with tired but practiced hands, and in one of the suites, a woman brushed her hair slowly in the mirror. She wasn't thinking of danger, only of home, and how strange it felt to be suspended between two worlds, one left behind in Europe, and one waiting across the ocean. The musicians played into the night, gentle waltzes, familiar tunes, soft melodies drifting through the grand halls. To the ears of those nearby, it was just background, a pleasant hum behind conversation. But those songs would become echoes in history. Down in the boiler rooms, men worked with sleeves rolled and foreheads shining. They shoveled coal, fed the fire, kept the giant heart of Titanic beating. They didn't see the stars. They didn't know the calm. They only knew heat, metal, sweat, and duty. And then, at 11:40 p.m., it happened. It began with a sound, not a crash, not a roar, but a tearing, a low, scraping moan, as if the ship herself was gasping, a long breath drawn through her steel skin. For many passengers, it felt like nothing, a shudder, a faint jolt, like the ship had run over something soft, something barely worth mentioning. Some lifted their heads, others didn't stir at all. Sleep reclaimed them quickly, but on the bridge, eyes widened. Orders were shouted. Stop engines! Hard to starboard! Too late. The iceberg had struck the starboard side, and beneath the waterline, 6 compartments had been ripped open, tiny tears by themselves, but together, too much. The unsinkable ship had been wounded. The officers moved quickly. They woke the captain. They summoned the designer, Thomas Andrews. They examined the damage. The truth was slow to form, but once it arrived, it settled like ice. She would sink, not immediately, not with drama, but steadily, inevitably. Thomas Andrews, who knew the ship more intimately than anyone alive, understood the truth before the others. He stood still for a moment, his hand resting lightly on a doorway. Then he turned and began walking, room to room, person to person, quietly explaining what must be done. At first, few believed it. After all, she was the Titanic. How could this be? Passengers murmured, but didn't panic. Many even returned to bed. The engines had stopped, but the lights still glowed. The air still felt calm. The music, in some places, still played, but the ship was bleeding. Water poured in, unseen by most. Decks began to tilt, subtly, just enough to make a glass slide, just enough to make a mother glance down at her child's cradle. The call for lifeboats came, but there weren't enough. Not for everyone, not for the thousands on board. You see, the ship had been built with lifeboats only for about half her passengers, because she was believed to be unsinkable. And so, as the crew moved to lower them, they did so with confusion, with hesitation, with disbelief. Some boats left half empty, some people refused to board, thinking they were safer on the Titanic than in a small boat on the open sea. Mothers clutched their children, fathers kissed them goodbye, lovers held hands, whispering promises they could not keep. And overhead, the stars kept watching, silent, unmoving, witnesses to the unraveling of a dream. There was no chaos yet, just disbelief, soft cries, a chill deepening in the air, and beneath it all, a slow, quiet descent. The Titanic was beginning to bow. Still, the ship held on to her grace. She did not scream. She did not rage. She sank like a queen, with dignity, with sorrow, with the weight of too many stories. And so, in the cold of the North Atlantic night, a new kind of silence began to grow. Not the peace of the sea before, but the hush that comes when hearts begin to understand that this night is different, that this moment will change everything. There is a moment just before fear takes hold, where the soul hesitates, where time seems to stretch longer than it should, where you can hear your own heartbeat even among hundreds of others. That's what the decks of Titanic felt like now. The tilt of the ship was subtle still, but real. Water, that patient force, was creeping up from below. It moved without emotion, without sound, filling chambers, winding through stairwells, claiming space that had once held laughter. Above, passengers were being gently urged toward the lifeboats, just for precaution, many were told. Only temporary. You'll come back on board shortly. Some laughed nervously. Some refused. Some obeyed without a word. Men stepped back and let women pass. Husbands placed trembling kisses on cold cheeks, holding their wives' hands for one final second longer than they were supposed to. Children cried, not understanding, just sensing that something had shifted in the air. One boy, no older than 8, clutched a wooden toy in one hand, the other buried in his father's coat. His mother knelt down, smoothing his hair gently. "Stay close to your sister," she whispered. Then to her husband, just one look, no words, because what could be said? On the upper decks, some passengers still sipped coffee, still asked questions that had no answers. They were dressed in their finest: silk, wool, lace, clothes made for parties and promenades, now standing beneath stars, wind whipping their collars. The night colder than it had any right to be, the lifeboats began to lower, one by one. The ropes creaked, voices called down into the black water, and still so many stood waiting, hoping it was all just a mistake, that soon someone would come and say, "All is well, go back to bed." But the truth couldn't be undone. The ship was dying, and the band, oh, the band played on. Gentle hymns, soft waltzes, no panic in their eyes, only calm. Perhaps that music saved more souls than the lifeboats ever could. It reminded people of home, of beauty, of stillness. They played for courage, for peace, for those walking toward lifeboats with shaking knees, and for those choosing to stay behind. The ship was now at an angle. Walking in heels was nearly impossible. People stumbled. Chairs slid from their places. But no one screamed yet, even as the lower decks began to fill with ice-cold water, even as crew members knocked on doors, shouting now, even as lifeboats disappeared into the dark. There was still a softness, a slowness, a kind of sacred stillness in the air, until the realization reached everyone. There would not be enough room. Not all would be saved. And then came the moments that would never leave history. Men began stepping aside, not because they were told, but because they chose to, not out of obligation, but out of love. Fathers, sons, newlyweds, strangers, they stood back, hands tucked behind their backs, chins lifted against the wind, and watched as the lifeboats disappeared, carrying away the ones they loved most. In the final boats, screams began to rise. Those who waited too long now scrambled, begged, pushed. The calm shattered. Officers fired warning shots into the sky. Some drew weapons. Some wept. And yet the sea stayed still. So terribly still. Inside the grand staircase, the chandelier still swung, though now it tilted strangely, casting fractured light across marble floors that glistened with seawater. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, walked the halls alone, helping where he could, quiet, determined. He had built her, and he would go down with her. One steward was seen wrapping a shawl around a crying woman's shoulders, then turning away quickly because he knew what came next, and didn't want her to see the truth in his eyes. Down in the smoking room, a few older men sat with cigars. They didn't rise. They talked softly of horses, of politics, of the price of tea, as if pretending, just for a few more minutes, that the world was still whole. In one corner, a young couple held hands, their cheeks pressed together, eyes closed. They had only met days ago, but time had stretched differently aboard Titanic. They had found something real, and now they would leave this world together. And still the ship sank, lights flickered, the music slowed, decks groaned as pressure deepened, and then, with a sound like the sky breaking in two, the ship began to split. A deep, thunderous roar, metal twisting, wood shattering, voices rising in terror. But in that chaos, some still reached for one another. Some still whispered prayers. Some still looked to the stars, as if asking them to remember, and the sea finally moved, not with waves, but with arms open to receive. In the final minutes, time did something strange. It stretched, it clung, it held everything in place, as if the world itself could not bear to let go of what was about to be lost. Titanic, now broken, her stern still fighting to stay above the waves, her bow already swallowed whole, was surrounded by the sounds of human desperation, cries, splashes, the haunting wail of hundreds of voices merging into one terrible sound, a sound that would never be forgotten by those who heard it. The cold was no longer something you could ignore. It was a force, merciless, slicing through layers of clothing, through skin, down to the very soul. The water was like knives. For those who had made it into the lifeboats, safety was only partial. They could do nothing but watch, floating just far enough away to be helpless. They looked back toward the ship, to the sight of her rising, higher, higher, until her stern pointed up to the stars, as if reaching for something she could not grasp. And then, the final plunge, the last groan, the lights flickered once more, then went out, one by one. Darkness claimed her. The great ship slipped beneath the sea, not with grace anymore, but with violence. A roar, a shudder, and then silence. Just silence. The kind that doesn't feel peaceful, but empty, too big to understand. In the lifeboats, they sat, clinging to one another, to hope, to memory, to anything. Some rowed, some prayed, some stared blankly at the water, refusing to believe what their eyes had seen. And across the surface, floating in that icy blackness, were the ones who hadn't made it. So many, too many, still, silent. Some had jumped with life jackets, but the cold had taken them. Others clung to debris, only to be pulled down by exhaustion. But among them, there were a few still breathing, still calling out. And from the lifeboats, some turned back. Some wanted to return, but they were told no. If they went back, the fear was the boats would be overwhelmed, that more would die. So they sat, they listened to the cries, to the pleas, until those sounds too faded, until there was only water and stars. Hours passed, each one stretching into a lifetime. The sea, as calm as ever, now held the weight of so much sorrow. But the sky remained unchanged, glittering, beautiful, as if unaware. And then a light, far in the distance, the Carpathia, a ship answering the call. She came not with fanfare, but with quiet urgency. Her crew worked through the early dawn, pulling the survivors from the lifeboats, one by one. Blankets were wrapped around shivering shoulders. Hands were held, names whispered, and questions hung in the air, unanswered. Where is my husband? Did my sister survive? Will we be going back for them? But they were already gone. Out of the more than 2,200 souls aboard Titanic, only around 700 survived. So many stories stopped mid-sentence. In the days that followed, the world grieved. Newspapers printed names, families waited at ports, and questions filled every room. How could this happen? Why weren't there enough boats? Who was to blame? But the truth was, there was no single answer, only the aching reminder that even the grandest things can fall, that even the unsinkable can sink. And yet, in the wreckage of that night, there were glimmers of something else, of bravery, of sacrifice, of love so fierce it refused to let go, even in the face of death. Men giving up their places, crew staying behind to help, strangers holding strangers in the dark, a band playing to the very end. These were the things that remained. The ship was gone, but the heart of Titanic, the people, their courage, their grace, lived on, and in time, the world would remember not just the loss, but the light that flickered within it. Morning came slowly, and with it, a stillness so heavy it pressed down on the ocean like a sigh. The sun rose, not in triumph, but gently, as if even the sky mourned. Its light touched the ripples of the North Atlantic, but found no trace of the ship that once defied the sea. The Carpathia moved carefully through the gray water, her decks now crowded with the faces of those who had survived, wrapped in blankets, holding hands, whispering names, searching eyes scanning the horizon, not for rescue, but for those who would never arrive. Some stood in silence, hands trembling, not from cold, but from the realization that everything they knew had changed. Others sat curled on the floor, too tired to cry, too hollow to speak. A little girl clutched a stranger's coat, her parents lost in the dark. A man stared at a wedding ring in his hand, one he no longer wore, and still the sea rolled on, indifferent, endless, a witness that offered no answers. In the days that followed, news spread across the world like a storm, and the world, it stopped. In London, New York, Paris, Belfast, crowds gathered at newspaper stands. Letters went unanswered. Homes filled with silence. Mothers waited. Fathers collapsed into chairs they would never rise from. It wasn't just the loss of life. It was the loss of something more fragile, a belief that we could outsmart nature, that we could build forever. Titanic had been a marvel, but now she was a memory, a lesson, a name whispered through tears. Yet somehow, in the depth of that tragedy, a kind of quiet love emerged. People across the world grieved together. Strangers comforted strangers. Songs were sung, prayers were said, and candles lit, one flame for each soul. And those who survived, they carried the weight of remembering. They carried the stories, not just of the sinking, but of the people. They spoke of the baker who threw deck chairs into the water to help others float, of the engineer who stayed below until the end, keeping the lights on, of the musicians who played until the sea swallowed their song, of the mothers who kissed their children and let go, of the husbands who gave up their places, of the lovers who chose to die together. These were the stories that mattered, not the steel, not the size, not the luxury, but the people, always the people. And as the years passed, the world did not forget. Wreaths were laid, books were written, memorials were carved, and deep beneath the sea, the Titanic rested. Time wore away her edges, but not her meaning. She remained a monument, not of failure, but of humanity, of dreams, of courage, and in the hearts of those who still close their eyes and imagine her. She sails again, gliding through calm waters, filled with music, with laughter, with lives not lost, but paused in time, because stories, like hers, they don't truly end. They float on, in memory, in whispers, in the quiet places between sleep and waking. And now, as your body softens and your breath slows, let the sea become still once more. Let the stars above shimmer quietly, their light soft and far away. Let the ship drift peacefully, not toward tragedy, but toward forever. You are safe, you are warm, you are held. Sleep now, and let the story fade gently into dreams. The Carpathia moved slowly across the morning sea, carrying more than just the weight of those who had survived. It carried ghosts, memories, the breathless silence that clings to people who have lost too much in too little time. The decks were no longer a place of movement. They had become quiet altars. People stood huddled together, not out of fear anymore, but out of disbelief. Some whispered prayers into the ocean air. Others clung to names, to keepsakes, to images in their minds that they feared might fade. The ship's doctor moved from person to person, not always with medicine, sometimes just with a hand on a shoulder, a steady voice, a gentle reminder that they were still here. A young woman sat near the stern of Carpathia, her gown still soaked at the hem, her eyes wide. She held a damp glove in her lap. No one knew whose it was. Perhaps even she didn't, but she held it like it meant everything, like it tethered her to someone she couldn't bear to lose. Next to her, a man in his 60s looked out at the water, mouth slightly open, as if still trying to speak words that had never left his throat the night before. Around them, silence was a language now. No one dared to break it. They were living in a moment the world would never understand unless they had been there, unless they had heard the cries, seen the stars reflected in that merciless black water. The sun rose higher in the sky, warming nothing. A steward aboard Carpathia, no older than 25, wiped his hands on his coat before handing a child a biscuit. The little girl reached up wordlessly. She hadn't spoken since she had been pulled from her lifeboat. No one knew her name, only that she had clung to the edge of the boat with tiny frost-bitten fingers, calling out once and then going silent. Hours passed. When the ship finally turned toward New York, there was no cheer, no relief. There was only the ache of leaving something behind. A ship, yes. But more than that, there was a feeling that part of the world had been left in that cold water. And as the Carpathia steamed westward, each survivor carried a different grief. Some had lost families, others had lost friends, lovers, children, but many, perhaps most, had lost something less tangible, a belief in safety, a sense of control, the quiet illusion that the world made sense. A mother, cradling her infant who had been saved, kept turning her head toward the door, as if expecting her husband to appear, as if refusing to believe that a man who had kissed her forehead and buttoned her coat only hours ago could be gone. She whispered his name once, then again, then again. A man beside her offered his handkerchief. She didn't take it. She didn't even see it. Grief had taken root, too quickly, too deeply. Below deck, some of the survivors lay bundled in cots. Their clothes had been changed, but their expressions hadn't. Eyes staring at nothing. Mouths set in a strange shape, between sorrow and disbelief. A few murmured, a few shook in their sleep, but most simply lay still, like driftwood brought aboard from the sea. And yet, amid the stillness, small signs of life began to return. A cup of tea passed between hands, a nurse brushing a girl's tangled hair, two men folding a blanket together without speaking, a woman humming to herself, too quietly for others to hear. These moments, fragile and almost invisible, were the first steps back to something like living. Meanwhile, back across the ocean, in cities far from the sea, Newspapers filled with headlines too large to ignore. Titanic sinks. More than 1/500 feared lost. Ship of dreams turns to nightmare. People lined the streets outside newspaper offices. Men threw coins to boys on corners shouting the news. In homes, telegrams were clutched with shaking hands. In drawing rooms, silence replaced music. And at docks, families waited, some for answers, some in denial. A woman in New York sat in a wide bay window, holding a photograph. Her brother had sent word that he was sailing home. He had booked a second-class cabin. She had circled the date on the calendar. Now, she stared at that date, her thumb running across the paper until it smudged. She hadn't yet cried, not really, because it didn't feel real. How could something that grand just be gone? In London, a man closed the door of his office, sat at his desk, and stared at the blueprints of Titanic still framed on the wall. He had designed part of the promenade deck. He remembered how proud he had felt. Now, he only felt cold. He didn't move for hours. In Belfast, the shipbuilders wept, not just because of the loss, but because they had built her. They had believed in her, and now she was gone, and with her, a piece of them. Back on the Carpathia, night began to fall again. The sea stretched endlessly on all sides. There were no icebergs now, just soft waves and the faint whisper of wind against steel. Someone had lit a lantern near the bow. It glowed amber in the dark, a quiet warmth. A group of survivors gathered near it, not to talk, but simply to be near one another. Words weren't needed. What could be said? They just stood, wrapped in blankets, staring into that flickering light, remembering the glow of Titanic's chandeliers, the music, the sound of footsteps on her decks. And in that moment, though no one said it aloud, they all knew they would never be the same. Not because they had seen death, but because they had seen love. Real, desperate, courageous love. The kind that holds you when the world tilts. The kind that stays with you after the lifeboats are gone. And as they stood there, the stars appeared above them. The same stars, still watching, still shining, just like they had the night before. The Carpathia sailed through the darkness with a heavy stillness, like a great vessel gliding through a sea of grief. Though she moved forward, time on board felt suspended, like no one dared let it move too quickly, like rushing would break something even more than it had already been broken. Inside her cabins, people slept only in short, restless moments. Even with warm tea and dry clothes, sleep didn't come easily, because when your world shifts in a single night, your body doesn't know how to rest. It stays alert, remembering the sound of the screams, the cold that cut deeper than the water, the quiet absence of the ship that once seemed immortal. Some survivors clung to routine, desperate for a rhythm. They folded their blankets again and again, polished their shoes with trembling hands, tried to smooth their hair, fix their collars, small things. But when your world has collapsed, small things feel like anchors. A young steward aboard Carpathia helped an older woman to her seat, gently supporting her arm as if she were made of porcelain. She had lost both her sons. She had boarded the lifeboat only because they insisted. Now her hands sat still in her lap, empty. Not even her tears came any more. The steward offered her a biscuit. She took it, held it between her fingers. She didn't eat. At the end of the corridor, a man sat alone with his coat buttoned all the way up. Even though the cabin was warm, he hadn't spoken since being pulled aboard. No one knew his name, but his eyes followed everyone who passed, not with suspicion, but with the fragile gaze of someone still counting the people they lost. Elsewhere, a mother kept rocking, though no child lay in her arms. She whispered lullabies, hoping that somehow, in some way, her child still heard her. Out there, under the water, among the stars reflected on the sea, the ship's captain walked the halls in silence. He had not spoken much to the survivors, not because he lacked compassion, but because he carried the impossible weight of knowing he had arrived too late. He paused outside the dining area, watching the quiet gathering inside. People sat together at long tables, eating soup slowly, barely tasting it. They didn't speak. They simply sat together, a choir of hollow hearts, warming their hands around cups. Then came the sound of a violin, not a song, not a performance, just a slow, low note, trembling into the quiet like a breath. It came from a man near the corner, a passenger from first class who had survived. He had seen the band play the night the Titanic went under, and now he played not to entertain, but to remember, to keep something of them alive in the notes that floated upward. Others stopped eating. They turned to listen, and for a moment, the ship wasn't a rescue vessel. It was a chapel, a place of memory. The music spoke without needing words. I saw them. I heard them. I carry them now. And for many, that was enough. As Carpathia neared New York, the weather grew heavy with fog. It felt fitting, a veil, as though the city wasn't ready to receive the ship with open eyes. Crowds had gathered at the docks long before the ship came into view. People stood shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in coats, holding photographs, clutching each other's hands. Hope flickered in every face, and behind it, the dread, not knowing if the name on the list would be there, not knowing what they would see when the ship finally arrived. A boy stood at the edge of the crowd, his cap pulled low over his brow. He held a small bouquet of flowers. His father had been on the Titanic. He had promised him souvenirs. Now the boy stood there, unsure if he'd need the flowers for a welcome. or for goodbye. When the Carpathia finally came into sight, a wave of quiet swept the crowd. No cheers, no celebration, only the sound of the ropes being thrown, the creak of the ship settling, and the quiet sobs of people bracing for truth. One by one, the survivors began to disembark. Some walked with dignity, heads high despite the sorrow. Others stumbled, supported by strangers or carried by crew. A nurse handed a baby down to a waiting relative. The child cried, but it was a sound of life. A young woman stepped off the gangplank and dropped to her knees, touching the solid ground with trembling hands, as if unsure it was real. And in the crowd, shouts of names, tears of relief, cries of agony. He's alive. She's not here. Please, check again. Some people found their loved ones in that sea of faces. Others never would. And through it all, reporters scribbled in notebooks. Photographers took pictures. Questions were asked. Answers choked out between tears. But the survivors, they didn't think in headlines. They didn't speak in facts. They remembered a hand held, a voice calling out, face disappearing into black water. No article could contain that. No words could make it whole again. Days passed. Funerals were held. Lists were published. Telegrams sent. And in every corner of the world, people whispered the name Titanic, not just as a ship, but as a wound, a ghost. Poems were written, letters tucked away in drawers. Children asked questions their parents didn't know how to answer. And survivors, they began the quiet, lifelong work of remembering. Some spoke often, telling their stories again and again, not to relive it, but to honor it. Others never spoke at all. They built their silence like a wall around the memory, not out of shame, but out of reverence. They carried it alone, and in that silence, the ship still sailed, not in the sea, but in memory, in every flicker of candlelight, every nighttime reflection, every soft goodbye whispered to a photo in a frame. Titanic became something else, not just a tragedy, but a place, a feeling, a reminder of how fragile we are and how fiercely we can love even in the dark. The days after Carpathia docked were strangely hollow. For those who survived, the world had shifted, and yet everything around them remained. Painfully ordinary, streets bustled, trains ran, shop windows gleamed with advertisements for dresses and gramophones, as if nothing had happened. But for the people who had stood on the decks of the Titanic, who had held someone's hand as it slipped away into the sea, there was a quiet, invisible line between them and the rest of the world. Many returned home to places that no longer felt like home. Suitcases were unpacked, clothes folded, letters stared at, but not read. And still, the mind returned to that night Again and again, one man, a teacher from England, tried to return to his classroom just 2 weeks later, but each time he looked at his students' faces, he remembered the little boy who had clutched his coat in the lifeboat, who had cried for his mother until the sun came up, a mother they'd never found. The teacher stood in front of the blackboard, piece of chalk in hand, and said nothing. The class waited. Then quietly, he walked out and didn't return for months. A woman in Boston, once the host of lavish tea parties and musical evenings, now spent her days staring out her parlor window. She had been rescued. Her husband had not. He had given up his seat in the lifeboat, pressed her fingers to his lips, and stepped back into the night. Now, she traced the glass of the window each evening with her finger, as if drawing his silhouette again and again. They said time would heal, but time, it doesn't fix absence. It only dulls the edges. And the survivors, they learned to live with the ache. Some found meaning in it. Others did not. The world, meanwhile, demanded answers. Inquiries were held in London and Washington. Committees, testimonies, formal questions asked in stiff voices. Why wasn't the ship carrying enough lifeboats? Why were ice warnings ignored? Who made the call to keep the ship at such speed? The crew members who survived sat stiffly in wooden chairs, their voices echoing in grand chambers. Some wept while speaking. Others stared blankly ahead. The captain of Carpathia, Arthur Rostron, spoke with quiet humility, describing how his crew had prepared warm blankets and drinks, how they had sailed through dangerous waters to get there. Quickly, he was hailed as a hero. The captain of Titanic, Edward Smith, had gone down with the ship, and so some blamed him, others defended him. But the truth lay somewhere murkier than blame or praise, because it wasn't just one mistake, it was many. Pride, overconfidence, the illusion that progress makes us invincible, and Titanic paid the price for it all. In Belfast, where the ship had been built, there was a mourning unlike any other. The men who had laid the rivets, who had welded her walls, now carried the knowledge that their hands had crafted something that became a grave. Some couldn't work again. Others returned to the shipyards in silence. One man, a foreman, visited the dry dock late at night, stood at the empty space where Titanic had once sat. He touched the cold iron beams still standing and whispered, "I'm sorry," though no one heard him. In the pubs, men drank without speaking. Their laughter had left with the ship. In the churches, candles were lit every night, not just for the dead, but for the ones who remained, who had to carry the knowing. And what of the ocean? It kept its secrets. Years passed, and Titanic slept beneath the waves, almost 2.5 miles below the surface. In the dark, in the quiet, the ship that had once held chandeliers and violins now lay covered in rust, her railings twisted, her once bright carpets swallowed by silt. But even down there, in that lonely stillness, there was a kind of peace. Shoals of fish moved through the grand staircase. Tiny organisms clung to her hull. The sea had claimed her, but gently, like a keeper of sacred things. And for decades, no one saw her again, only in stories, in photographs, in the eyes of survivors who aged as the ship waited below. In 1985, more than 70 years after she sank, a deep-sea expedition found her again, not through magic, not through rumor, but through science and a desire to look the past in the eye. The footage was grainy, ghostly. There she was, split in two, silent, unmoving. But there, the footage showed a dinner plate still resting on the ocean floor. A pair of boots, a broken teacup, a bronze cherub from the grand staircase, still watching over nothing. And suddenly, the world remembered her again, not just in history books, but in living color. People cried, not just because of what was lost, but because somehow she was still beautiful, still noble, still standing in her own way, and the survivors who still lived, now old, some near their final days, watched the footage on television screens, and they wept because they had returned, not to the ship itself, but to the memory, to the place in their hearts that had never left the deck. They remembered the smell of salt, the sound of the orchestra, the feel of wood beneath their feet. They remembered love and fear and silence. And now, the world remembered with them in the years that followed the rediscovery of the Titanic. A quiet kind of reverence grew around her. She was no longer just a shipwreck. She was a time capsule, a frozen moment beneath the sea, where every rust-covered plate and every twisted railing told a human story. Researchers and oceanographers studied her with care, sending down remote-operated submarines, their lights glowing like distant stars in the deep. They moved slowly through the wreck, gently capturing images of what had once been grandeur. A chandelier, still hanging but no longer shining. A set of suitcases stacked neatly near a collapsed wall. A child's porcelain doll, her face cracked, resting in the silt. The sea had taken so much, and yet it had preserved fragments, echoes, enough to make the world pause. Some debated whether the ship should be raised, whether her relics should be brought up to light, but others believed she should be left undisturbed, allowed to rest in the quiet blue where her story ended. Survivors who remained watched these discussions from afar. By now, they were in their 80s, some 90s. Their hair had turned white, their steps slower, their voices softer, but the memories remained. One woman, who had been just a teenager in third class, spoke in an interview from her small house in rural Canada. She held a photograph of her family, her parents, her younger sister, all of them lost that night. She had survived by chance. An officer had pulled her from the crowd, pushed her into a lifeboat she hadn't wanted to board. Now, 80 years later, her voice cracked as she spoke. "I didn't know why I was saved," she whispered, "but I promised I'd live enough for all of us." And she had. She became a teacher. She planted gardens. She sang to her grandchildren and told them the truth, not just about the ship, but about kindness, about strength, about remembering. Every April, those who cared still marked the anniversary. Some gathered near the sea. Some lit candles in their windows. Some simply stood still at 11:40 p.m., hands clasped, remembering the sound the world must have made when steel met ice. In Belfast, at the Titanic Memorial, names were read out loud. All of them. Not just the famous, not just the first class. Everyone, because Titanic didn't just carry passengers. She carried lives. A fireman who had lied about his age to join the crew. A French tailor with a suitcase full of dresses he made by hand. A newlywed couple on their honeymoon. A nanny, a musician, a cook, all equal in memory now. And as those names were read, the wind always seemed to still, as if the sea itself was listening. Titanic also lived on in art, books, paintings, songs, even movies, some imagined, some deeply researched, all trying to capture something that no story could fully hold. But perhaps the reason we keep telling her story is not because of how she sank, but because of how people loved in the face of it. Because when the world tilted, people still helped each other into boats, still gave away life jackets, still played music, and that is what lingers. In 1997, a film brought Titanic's story to a new generation. It was fictional in parts, yes, but the heartbeat was real. It reminded people of the cold, of the beauty, of the moment everything changed. And in theaters around the world, people wept, not just because the ship went down, but because love had existed there, because people had made impossible choices, because tragedy reminds us how precious and fragile every breath can be. For a while, everyone was talking about Titanic again. But for those who had carried her memory all along, she never really left. One man, a boy at the time of the sinking, watched the film in a private theater, too frail to sit with crowds. When it ended, he didn't speak for a while. Then, in a voice cracked by time, he said, "It wasn't just a ship, it was a world, and we lost it." Even today, when you say the name Titanic, people know. They feel something, not because of metal or technology or even the scale of the disaster, but because she reminds us that life is fleeting, that even the grandest dreams are delicate, and that in the quiet moments, When someone gives up their place for another, when hands are held in the dark, when songs are played for courage, that is where the human spirit shows itself. In lifeboats, in silence, in soft goodbyes, whispered beneath the stars. Titanic reminds us how fragile we are and how beautiful we can be. Even in the face of the end, time moved forward, as it always does. Years turned into decades, and the century mark drew near, and still the memory of the Titanic refused to fade, not because of the scale of her loss, but because of how deeply she had entered the hearts of people. Her story became more than history. It became something quieter, more intimate, like a song passed down, not through words, but through feelings. Each generation found their own way to understand her, to stand at the edge of her story and peer into its silence. Some visited museums, gazed through glass at letters written aboard, at jewelry pulled from the deep, at shoes carefully preserved, each item ordinary and holy at once, because the mundane becomes sacred when it survives what so many did not: a worn leather bag, a comb, a diary with its final page left blank. Visitors would lean in close to read, and somewhere in that stillness, they'd realize these weren't just artifacts, they were echoes. In a small town in Wales, an elderly woman kept a single photograph on her mantel. It showed a group of passengers on Titanic's deck, laughing in the sunshine, bundled in coats, holding onto their hats in the breeze. One of them was her mother, just 18 at the time. She had never spoken much about that night, only that it had changed her, taught her to notice the small things: the sound of birds in the morning, the warmth of soup on a cold day, the weight of another hand in your own. She had survived, but left a part of herself out at sea. Now, her daughter, older than her mother had ever lived to be, lit a candle every April by that photograph and whispered, "Thank you for coming back." Far across the world, in Japan, in Australia, in Brazil, Titanic was remembered too, not because of nationality, but because her story belonged to everyone: the longing, the loss, the way strangers became family in a matter of hours. It was a reminder that humanity isn't measured by success or invention, but by what we do when it all begins to fall apart. And Titanic had shown, in the most terrible of ways, that love still bloomed even when hope dimmed. That courage still stood tall as the decks tilted. That beauty could live, even in the dark. At the site of her resting place, scientists sent more missions, not to disturb, but to understand. They found the wreck changing, eroding slowly, her bones eaten away by time and salt and living things, and they realized one day she would vanish completely. The ship would dissolve, and only memory would remain. It was a sobering thought, but perhaps also a kind one, because even grief, when it fades, leaves behind the softness of remembrance, a peaceful ache, a hum in the heart. Survivors by now had grown few. Each year, fewer and fewer candles were lit by those who had been there, until finally only silence remained. No voices left to speak of the cold, no eyes left to recall the stars above the sinking, no hands left to describe the weight of another's palm in those final minutes. And yet, she was not forgotten. The Titanic lived on in lullabies, in novels and films, in paintings brushed with moonlight, in dreams where the deck still gleamed beneath the sun, a ship frozen in time, a heartbeat from a different century, still echoing in the stillness. And sometimes, when the sea is calm and the sky is heavy with stars, you might feel her there, not as a wreck, but as a whisper, carrying with her the voices of those who were never found, the songs never finished, the stories never told, carrying with her the hands that reached out across class, across fear, to comfort, to save, to say, I'm here. In the end, perhaps that's what Titanic truly was. Not a ship, but a mirror, one that showed us what it means to build, to believe, to lose, to love. She carried the hopes of the world, and when she fell, she left behind something more lasting than steel. She left behind a story of the human heart, and stories like that, they never sink. In a quiet museum tucked away in the heart of Halifax, Nova Scotia, not far from where the sea reaches up to touch the land, lies a cemetery where many of Titanic's dead found their final rest. The headstones are simple, gray, weather-worn. Most of them carry names, some just numbers, each one marking a life that ended not with age, but with water and silence. Visitors walk among the rows, slowly, voices hushed, as if the ground itself asks for reverence. A little girl kneels at one of the stones, laying a flower her mother handed her. She doesn't know the story, not really, but she understands that something happened, something worth being quiet for. Inside the museum, behind glass, there's a pair of shoes, small, worn, believed to belong to the unknown child. For years, no one knew his name. He was found floating in the sea, gently cradled by the arms of the sea itself, as if even the ocean couldn't bear to let him go, unheld. Sailors wept when they found him, carried him to shore, paid for his burial, and visitors still stop at his grave with tears in their eyes for a child they never met. Later, DNA gave him back his name, Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a toddler from England, lost with his entire family. But even when he was just the unknown, he was never forgotten. That's the thing about Titanic. Her memory isn't grand because of her size, or her passengers' wealth, or even the scale of the loss. It's grand because of the way it made people feel, the way it forced them to look inward, to ask what they would have done. who they would have saved, what love means when the water is rising. In classrooms around the world, children still study the Titanic. They memorize dates and names and statistics, but sometimes a teacher pauses in the middle of the lesson. Her voice softens, and she tells them the part that doesn't live in textbooks, about the violinist who played until the very end, about the baker who floated for hours in the freezing sea, kept alive by sheer will and a bit of brandy, about the man who held his wife's hand on the deck and whispered, "Where you go, I go." And in those stories, the children don't just learn about a ship, they learn about humanity. One teacher hangs a large photograph of the ship above her chalkboard. Each year, her students ask why. She smiles and says, "Because it reminds me that even the strongest things can break, but the love inside them doesn't." And so Titanic lives on in the softness of bedtime stories, in the quiet of late-night documentaries, in the care people take to say her name with respect, not as a cautionary tale alone, but as something more delicate, more precious. Some people visit the Titanic exhibit and are surprised by what moves them. It's not the artifacts, it's the handwritten letters, the photos of families leaning into one another on the deck, a diary entry that stops mid-sentence, a ticket that was never punched. They realize, standing there, that this wasn't about history. It was about people. It was about how fragile we are, how brave we can be, how in the space of one single night, strangers became brothers, lovers became legends, and time split into before and after. There's a replica of the grand staircase in one exhibit. People stand at the top and look down, imagining the sound of music rising from the decks below. Some close their eyes, try to hear it, try to feel it, just for a moment, and when they open them again, many are wiping away tears, because the loss still lingers, even though the sea has tried to smooth it over, even though the wreck grows quieter year by year, even though the people who were there are now all gone. Memory keeps breathing. Somewhere out there in the deep Atlantic, Titanic rests, two halves, hundreds of feet apart, slowly being reclaimed by the ocean that swallowed her. But for many, she's not down there. Not really. She's in the stories, whispered at kitchen tables, in the songs sung quietly in late hours, in the flicker of candlelight on April nights, when people remember without even knowing why. She's in the hand that reaches out during crisis, the stranger who gives up a seat, the person who chooses love, even when fear would be easier. That's where Titanic lives now, not beneath the waves, but within us, somewhere in the stillness of an early morning sea, when the fog hangs low and the waves move with slow reverence. There's a quiet sense that the ocean remembers. It remembers the weight of steel breaking the surface, the echo of voices lifted in joy, and the silence that followed. The Titanic rests far below, untouched by light, beyond the reach of storms. But her presence isn't confined to the dark. She's in the hearts of those who carry her memory forward in quiet ways, often without realizing. A man visits the coast of Ireland every year. He brings with him a small notebook, worn at the edges, filled with his grandmother's handwriting. She had been 16 when she boarded the ship, full of dreams about America, a heart stitched with both fear and excitement. She had survived, but left pieces of herself behind on that cold night. Her letters never spoke of the sinking in detail, only of the people. The baker who gave her a crust of bread in third class. The girl she played cards with on the second day, who wasn't seen after the lifeboats launched. The officer who pulled her over the rail and told her to hold on tight, that everything would be all right, even when they both knew it wouldn't. Each April, her grandson sits on the wet stones of the coast and reads her words aloud. There's never an audience, just the wind, just the sea, but he reads them anyway, because some things deserve to be remembered aloud. Not far from the coast of Newfoundland, fishermen sometimes say they feel a heaviness in the water near the coordinates of the wreck. It's probably nothing, just imagination. The sea plays tricks on even the most seasoned eyes. But when the fog is thick and the air carries that peculiar, weighty hush, they speak softer, pull their nets in a little more gently, because they know what lies beneath, and whether they believe in ghosts or not, they believe in loss. The ocean is vast, indifferent, and ancient, but Titanic marked her, not in maps or currents, but in memory. In Paris, a woman paints the same image over and over again, a ship against a silver sky, always from a distance, always slightly blurred, like a memory you're not sure is yours. She doesn't sell them. They line the walls of her apartment, floor to ceiling. People who visit ask why. She simply says, I lost someone, not on the ship, not in the sea, but someone who taught her about it, someone who held her hand in a museum once, pointed to a photo of the grand staircase and said, imagine the lives that walked those steps. He's gone now, but in her paintings, he returns, as does the ship, always just on the edge of mist. There's a little boy in school who doesn't know the whole story yet, but he hears the word Titanic in class, and it stirs something in him. Later that night, he asks his grandmother about it. She tells him it was a big ship that sank a long time ago. He asks why. She pauses. She doesn't want to explain the coldness, the fear, the lifeboats. Not yet. So she says, sometimes even the strongest things break, but the love doesn't go down with them. The boy nods, and though he may not understand, something in her voice makes him want to. That night, he dreams of stars above a dark ocean and a song played softly on a violin. Back in New York, on the dock where the Carpathia once arrived, Few people stop to read the plaque, but sometimes someone does. A young woman with a stroller, an elderly couple holding hands, a tourist who wasn't looking for it, but finds themselves rooted there, reading the names. They pause, maybe not for long, but long enough, and when they walk away, the silence behind them feels full, like they've carried something with them. Museums change exhibits, cities grow, technology leaps forward, but Titanic remains, not because she was the largest ship. Others have surpassed her, not because she sank. Many have, but because of the human heart she carried. The night she went down, the world was watching itself in a mirror, its pride, its limits, and in the reflection were faces, mothers who wrapped their children in scarves and whispered lullabies one last time, fathers who stepped back from lifeboats without a word, friends who clung to each other in the freezing dark, musicians who played not to be brave, but to be kind, and strangers who became family because the world was ending around them and they had no one else. Titanic did not sink because of one mistake. It was many. Hubris, haste, missed warnings. But what floated to the surface was not blame. It was grace. Because in those final moments, when the ship tilted and the night cracked open, people revealed who they truly were. Not passengers, not classes, not names on a manifest, just people, loving, fearing, holding on, and maybe that's why we still speak her name. Because she holds all of us. She reminds us that no matter how advanced we become, we are still vulnerable, still made of soft hearts and fragile dreams. And though we build big things, ships, cities, futures, it's the quiet choices that last longest. The hand offered to a stranger, the place given up in a lifeboat, the final words spoken into the wind, I love you. Those are the things the ocean could never take. They drift still, in stories, in hearts, in the hush of waves at night. Titanic isn't just a shipwreck. She is a memory, a lesson, a prayer, and as long as we remember the people, not just the steel, she will never truly be gone. Even now, more than a century later, there are moments when the story of the Titanic sneaks back into the world in ways no one expects, not in headlines or films, but in the sudden pause of a stranger visiting a museum, in the soft chords of a string quartet echoing through an old ballroom, in a grandmother tracing the edge of a faded photograph as her eyes grow misty, remembering something she was told long ago, not because she lived it, but because it lived in her family, passed down like a locket, delicate and heavy all at once, carrying with it not just the memory of a ship, but of a night when the stars watched in silence and the sea cradled more than metal. It cradled souls. There is something about the sea deep and ancient and unknowable, that makes it the perfect resting place for something as immense and delicate as the memory of Titanic. It does not boast or weep. It holds, it keeps, and down there, 2 miles beneath the surface, in a world of blackness and pressure where light has never touched, the great ship sleeps. Her bow, once pointed toward glory, now sinks into the seabed like a cathedral lost to time. Her railings, curled and crumbling, still follow the lines of elegance. Her windows, shattered or swallowed, reflect nothing now but the quiet of the deep. No footsteps walk her halls, no laughter fills her rooms. And yet, if you listen, if you truly imagine the stillness down there, you can almost hear something, a breath, a hush, the echoes of lives, frozen not in fear, but in love. For all the years that followed, it wasn't the luxury that people remembered, not the sweeping staircases or velvet-lined parlors or the crystal chandeliers. It was the moments of the human soul cracking open, one after another, in a quiet chain of bravery. The baker who threw every chair he could overboard so someone might cling to it. The engineers who stayed below, knowing the ship was lost, but refusing to leave their posts, keeping the lights burning to the very end so others could see. The man who handed his life jacket to a stranger with trembling fingers. The woman who stepped out of the lifeboat and back onto the ship because she couldn't imagine a world without her husband in it. These were the truths that settled deep into the hearts of those who heard them, long after the headlines faded. Even today, when ships pass over that stretch of the North Atlantic, some captains still tip their hats, a quiet nod, a moment of silence, not tradition, not superstition, just respect, because some places hold more than coordinates. Some waters remember. There are schools where children are taught not only the facts, the dates, the dimensions, the mistake of too few lifeboats, but also the feelings. Teachers show pictures of third-class cabins and ask, "What do you think this child hoped for when she boarded this ship?" And children answer with such honesty, "She probably wanted a bed of her own. She wanted her mom to be happy. Maybe she thought America would be sunny." And in that moment, the Titanic becomes something more than history. It becomes a shared heartbeat. There are writers who still sit down with pen and paper and try to capture her, not the ship, but the weight of her, the dream of her. They write novels not just about sinking, but about dancing, about strangers meeting on the promenade, about first kisses under lantern light. They write poems not just about cold water, but about the warmth of a hand in yours while the deck tilts beneath your feet. Because to understand Titanic fully is not just to understand her tragedy, but her life, her brilliance, her promise. And then there are the dreamers, those who never knew anyone on the ship, who weren't even born when she sailed, but who feel drawn to her story as if pulled by a thread. They read every book, visit every exhibit, memorize the passenger list as if each name were a friend. They know that there was a honeymoon couple in second class, that a boy was born on board just days before the sinking, that there was a dog who refused to leave her owner's side. These details may seem small, but to the dreamers, they are everything. They are the color and breath of a world that deserved to be remembered in full, not just for how it ended, but for how it lived. There is a hotel in Belfast where the walls are lined with paintings of Titanic and where a replica staircase curves upward toward a ceiling painted with stars. Guests walk its halls slowly. Some pause to run their fingers along the railings. Others stop at the window and stare out toward the dry dock where she was once built. One woman, visiting alone, stands in the ballroom and closes her eyes. She doesn't need music. She imagines it anyway. A soft waltz, the distant clink of a champagne glass, the gentle chatter of passengers who had no idea what was to come. She sways once, then opens her eyes. She doesn't smile. She doesn't cry. She just nods to herself, as if to say, I was here, and so were they. Sometimes people ask, why does Titanic matter so much? After all this time? The answer isn't always easy to put into words, but maybe it's because she was more than a ship. She was a symbol of everything humans are capable of: ambition, beauty, error, courage, love. She carried thousands of souls across the sea and into eternity. And every time we remember her, we're really remembering each of them, their laughter, their bravery, their final moments. That's the gift she left us. Not just a story, but a reflection of who we are, of who we want to be when the night is cold and the stars shine down and the sea begins to rise. In the quiet spaces between what we know and what we feel, the Titanic still floats, not in the ocean, not in time, but in us. She lives in the breath we hold when watching a ship pull away from shore, in the way we grip a loved one's hand just a little tighter after reading her story, in the hush that falls over a room when someone speaks of her, not with drama, but with reverence, because somehow this ship, this single vessel on a single voyage, managed to stitch herself into the fabric of human memory so completely that we still feel her presence more than 100 years later. There's something about her that refuses to vanish. A shipwreck usually fades. It rusts. It crumbles. It becomes part of the sea. But Titanic, she became part of the soul. Her story isn't one of ghosts and gloom. It's one of firelight and frozen tears, of aching silence and brave farewells, of music played until the sea reached the strings. It's the story of people who lived full lives inside the span of a single night. There are few places in history where we are given such a clear look at humanity stripped bare, not through speeches or flags or medals, but through moments. The third class father who placed his son in a lifeboat and stepped back, the crew member who tied belts and lowered boats even as water lapped at his boots, the officer who couldn't look away from the people screaming in the sea, but still ordered his boat to row onward, the steward who knocked on every door on his corridor, refusing to leave even one soul asleep, and the mother who, given a chance to live, stayed instead with her children, whispering lullabies as the ocean drew near. These aren't inventions. These were real people, ordinary in life, unforgettable in death, and somehow their choices linger louder than any disaster. Because when the great ship fell, it revealed something rare. Not just how fragile we are, but how good we can be. Every time a child hears about the Titanic for the first time, they ask the same things. Why weren't there enough boats? Were people scared? Would I have survived? But beneath those questions is something softer, deeper. Would I have been kind? Would I have been brave? Would someone have held my hand? Titanic gives us the chance to ask those questions, not just of the past, but of ourselves. There are people who keep pieces of her in their homes, not relics, but reminders. A photograph on a shelf, a ticket replica, a framed menu. They don't do it to show off. They do it because it feels sacred, a small way to hold onto the weight of what was lost and what was revealed. It's not just a fascination, it's a connection. And for those who lost ancestors aboard, the story is even more tender. They look into the eyes of a great-grandmother in a faded portrait and wonder what she felt on that night. Did she think of home, of sunlight on cobblestones, of the laughter of a child she'd never hear again? They trace their own lives back through that lineage. They realize that without one moment, one seat on a lifeboat, one stranger's kindness, they might not exist at all. It humbles them. In that way, Titanic reminds us that every life touches another, that even the smallest gesture, an outstretched hand, a shared coat, a whispered hold on, can echo for generations. Some have said Titanic was a symbol of pride, of man daring to conquer nature. Maybe that's true, but perhaps even more than that, she became a vessel for something far more eternal, empathy. Because when we speak of her now, it's not in mockery, it's not even in horror, it's in tenderness. A ship that broke the sea and opened the heart. In Southampton, there's a clock that never ticks again. It's fixed at the hour the Titanic left port, not because it broke, but because the city chose to freeze that moment forever. A city that lost hundreds of its sons and daughters. A place that still mourns, still honors, still remembers, and in Cherbourg and Queenstown and Halifax and New York, echoes remain in brass plaques, in museum walls, in the eyes of descendants who visit with hands tucked in pockets and voices lowered. No one leaves those places untouched. You come seeking facts, you leave carrying something else, a sense that the world, for all its noise and motion, still holds spaces where silence has weight, where memory breathes, where love lasted longer than steel. Even on calm waters today, some passengers, sailors, travelers, tourists, find themselves staring out into the deep, thinking of her. They may not speak her name, but the thought is there, the wonder, the ache, the imagined sound of a violin in the wind. And if you listen, really listen, sometimes it feels like she is near, not to haunt, but to remind that life is delicate, that time is brief, that courage is quiet, that kindness matters, and that stories, when held in the right hands, never truly end. Even now, in this world of speed and light and information, where everything seems to move too fast to hold, the story of Titanic slows us down. It invites us, gently and without force, to pause, to remember, to feel. There are few stories in history that still bring a hush into a room over 100 years later, but hers does, because when people speak of her, whether in a classroom, a museum, a documentary, or in quiet conversation, they don't speak in excitement. They speak in softness, like someone speaking of a dear friend who died long ago. Someone they didn't know, but somehow miss. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part. That Titanic was not just a ship and not just an event. She was, and is, a vessel for emotion. In the final hours before she sank, as the stars hung cold and clear above, and the sea stretched endlessly around, there was a profound and terrible quiet among those left on board. Not everyone screamed, not everyone panicked. Many stood in silence. Some whispered prayers. Others held hands without speaking. In that moment, when all that was certain fell away, people became who they truly were. Some sat with strangers and shared stories they hadn't spoken aloud in years. Some gave up their coats, their seats, their last hopes for survival, not because they had to, but because it felt right, because in the face of an ending, they chose love. There's something almost unbearable about that truth, that we see the deepest goodness in people not in their success, but in their final choices. Titanic offers that to us, a vision of humanity at its most exposed, and in so many moments at its most beautiful. The stories that emerged from that night are not all equal, and they're not all known. Some were buried with the ship, others lived only in the eyes of the people who carried them. A look, a sigh, a name spoken in sleep. But a few have found their way through time. The elderly couple, Isidore and Ida Strauss, who chose not to be separated, who were last seen sitting side by side on the deck, wrapped in each other's arms. She could have boarded a lifeboat, but she didn't. Where you go, I go, she said, and she meant it. The band, led by Wallace Hartley, who continued to play, not because they had orders to, but because they knew their music might bring calm to terrified hearts. Their final song is debated, but many believe it was Nearer, My God, to Thee, a hymn about comfort, about being carried home. The notes of that melody, imagined drifting across a freezing sea, are enough to bring tears even now. The engineer, Joseph Bell, who remained at his post with his men in the boiler room, trying to keep the lights on for as long as they could, knowing the cold was rising, that the engines would fail, that death was certain, but they stayed because they knew someone above might need a few more minutes of light. There were countless unnamed heroes, women passing their children to strangers because they couldn't all fit in the same lifeboat. Teenagers who gave up life jackets, passengers who carried the elderly, the injured, the fearful, up flights of stairs as the water chased behind them. Not all these stories are written down. Some were never told, but they live in the hush that comes after someone says, "I've been thinking about Titanic," because we know, even without all the facts, that something sacred happened there. The numbers are staggering. Over 1,500 lives lost. It's a number so large, it almost becomes impossible to grasp. But if you sit quietly and picture just one face at a time, the scope becomes clearer. A boy who had never seen the sea until that voyage. A mother trying to calm her crying infant. A young couple engaged just weeks before sailing. A captain who had commanded ships for decades, now walking the length of the bridge in silence. A maid polishing silver for a dinner that would never be eaten. Each one a universe. And in that, we are reminded each life holds depth beyond measure. And when that many universes are extinguished in one night, the world feels it, even if it doesn't realize why. There are people today who carry the Titanic inside them, not because they were told to, but because something in the story planted itself in their hearts. They feel it in fog, in cold water, in the sight of a ship cutting cleanly across the sea. They hear it in orchestras, in old hymns, in the silence between movements. They find themselves drawn to lighthouses, to waves, to the scent of salt in the air, and they say, without quite knowing why, she mattered. Somewhere, a girl sits on her bed, reading a novel based on Titanic. She closes the book and presses it to her chest. Not because the ending surprised her. She knew the ship would sink, but because the lives felt real, and part of her grieves for people she never met, for a time she never knew. That grief is real. It isn't dramatic or forced. It's the quiet kind that sits in the chest and makes you want to hold the people you love just a little longer. In this way, Titanic gives something back to the world even now. She teaches us not just to remember the past, but to honor the present, to value the moment, the gesture, the held hand, to listen more, to rush less, to be gentle, because none of them, none of the passengers, the crew, the families, boarded the ship thinking that April 15th would be their last day. They carried plans, hopes, worries about little things, and in a moment, everything changed. We can't change what happened, but we can let it shape how we live, with more tenderness, with more depth, with more love. And so, at the edge of this story, with all its weight and wonder, its sorrow and beauty, we come to the softest place, not an ending, but a settling, a place where the waves meet memory and hold it close, where the names of the lost are no longer just letters carved in stone or typed in ledgers, but whispers woven into the wind, into the stars, into the hearts of those who remember without ever having met them. What the Titanic left us was not only a wreck on the ocean floor or a cautionary tale in books, but something far more intimate, the truth that nothing, not steel, not certainty, not wealth, can shield us from the fragile brilliance of being alive. That in the end, what survives is not the ship, but the stories, not the engines or the chandeliers or the grand design, but the people, their decisions, their courage, their quiet dignity in the face of the impossible. When the sea closed over her hull that night, it did not erase her. It transformed her. She became not a ship that failed, but a vessel of memory, one that travels now not across the ocean, but through time, through hearts. It's in the way a teacher gently describes the sound of the ship splitting in two, not to frighten, but to help students understand that human strength comes not just in survival, but in the ways we care for one another when survival is uncertain. It's in the way a museum goer stops in front of a single shoe behind glass and realizes that someone once stood in it, once walked, once danced, once waited in line to board that ship with a dream tucked quietly inside their chest. It's in the way a writer sits in a dark room, pen in hand, trying to put words to something so vast, so heavy, so soft, it feels like writing down the wind. It's in the way a child, hearing the story for the first time, clutches their blanket and says, "Did anyone save the dog?" Not because they only care for the dog, but because they are beginning to understand the loss and kindness and the way both live together in one story. Titanic teaches us that human lives do not disappear. They ripple, they echo, they carry forward, not in grandeur, but in gentleness, in the way we treat the people near us, in the way we remember the ones who didn't come home. There are no more survivors now. The last one passed quietly, carrying the burden and honor of memory into the next world. But the ship sails on, not above the waves, but below them and beyond them, in books, in songs, in paintings, in poems, in the silent reverence of people who stop to look at the sea and feel something they can't explain. She sails through the dreams of artists and historians and quiet souls who feel close to something they never touched. And perhaps that's the greatest thing Titanic gave us. A reminder that even a story of loss can be a story of love, because the love didn't go down with the ship. It lived on in letters carried in coat pockets that were never delivered, in lullabies sung one last time as the lifeboats lowered, in the music that didn't stop playing, in the promises whispered as the stars stared down. It lives on now in you, listening, feeling, remembering. You are part of her story too, by carrying it gently, by honoring it in silence, by living a life of meaning, not despite its fragility, but because of it. And so now, as your eyes grow heavier and the world around you softens into shadow, imagine her once more, not broken and rusted in the deep, but whole again, her lights glowing, her decks alive with footsteps, the ocean calm, the sky bright with stars. She sails quietly through time, through memory, through dreams, and there, in the hush of that imagined voyage, you are safe, you are warm, you are held. Sleep now. Let the story drift far out to sea. Let it carry you gently. Let it go. There is a quiet that follows every great loss, not the silence of emptiness, but the stillness of something sacred. It does not rush in. It does not make itself loud. It simply settles over the heart, like mist on water, like snow on the branches of a tree that has seen many winters. And that is the kind of quiet that followed Titanic, not just in the wake of her sinking, but in every year that has passed since, even long after the last survivor whispered her final memory into the world. The story did not stop. It deepened. It softened. It rippled outward into places it had never been, touching lives far from the ocean, somewhere far from any coast, in a small room filled with books and dust and the sound of a ticking clock. An old man keeps a framed photograph on his desk. It is not a famous image, just a faded shot of a group of passengers on the promenade deck, their faces slightly blurred by time. One of them, near the back, barely visible, is his grandfather, a third-class passenger, a carpenter by trade. He was lost with the ship. The man never met him, but every time he walks past that photo, he touches the frame lightly with his fingers, as if to say, I know you were real. I know you mattered. He once wrote his grandfather's name in the back, of a book of poems, not for show, just so that it would live somewhere, so that someone might open that book one day, read the name, and pause, and remember that every name from that night carried a full life behind it. That is what remembrance truly is, not the building of statues or the ringing of bells, but the small human effort to keep someone's story from fading. And Titanic is filled with stories. There are those we know, the grand, the noble, the tragic, and there are others, quieter still, stories that rest in the spaces between facts, in the breath before a sentence ends, in the tear that slips down a cheek before a name is spoken. Some of those stories were never told at all, but they are still felt. They are felt when someone walks alone along a shore at dusk and finds their thoughts drifting not to the tasks of the day, but to a ship they never saw, a ship whose lights still flicker in the back of the mind. They are felt in the gentle way a mother tucks a blanket around her sleeping child, not knowing why the act feels heavier than usual. They are felt when music plays in the background of a crowded room and someone, without understanding why, pauses because the tune reminds them of something they can't quite place, something lost but familiar. Those are Titanic's echoes. They are not loud, they do not demand attention, but they last. They last in the way grief does, not as a wound, but as a presence, a shadow at the edge of memory, a hand at the back of the heart. And sometimes we carry these shadows without realizing it. We carry them in the gentleness we offer strangers, in the way we look up at the stars, in the quiet reverence we give to moments of beauty, because we know, perhaps better than we used to, how fleeting beauty can be. There are those who say Titanic was a symbol of human arrogance, that she represented pride and was punished for it. But perhaps, more truthfully, she was a symbol of longing, of all the things people hoped to reach: new lands, new lives, new love. She was filled with people trying to begin again, and beginning again is never a thing of arrogance. It is always a thing of hope. Hope was the quiet thread running through every corridor of the Titanic, stitched into suitcases, into letters tucked beneath pillows, into the eyes of those who boarded with hearts full of expectation. It shimmered in the polished wood of the grand staircase, in the warm tea poured by stewards on brisk mornings, in the sunlight spilling across the promenade deck as passengers leaned on the rails, imagining futures far away from home. They were not only sailing across an ocean, they were sailing into dreams. For some, those dreams were grand: a new business in America, a chance to walk streets where fortunes could be made, where names could be rewritten. For others, the dream was simpler: a warm room, a clean bed, bread without worry, They hoped for work, for stability, for something better than the cold brick towns or crowded cities they had left behind. There were those who left love behind to chase it again, those who brought it with them, newly married or still flushed with the soft electricity of new affection. And there were those who had never known it, who sat alone on the deck, watching the sea, wondering what they might find when they reached the other side. And all of them, every single one, had no idea that their story would not be told by the lives they planned, but by the night the ocean opened its arms and pulled their ship below. But even as she sank, slowly at first and then with final violence, she did not take hope with her. It scattered like stardust into the memories of those who survived, into the stories told to children at bedsides and kitchen tables, into the hearts of those who, years later, would read the names and feel them stir something soft and unspoken, because hope is like that. It does not vanish with the fall of steel or the extinguishing of lights. It lingers, even underwater, even in silence, and in the years that followed, hope rose again in the voices of survivors who chose to speak not just of the horror, but of the beauty, of the kindness shown by strangers, the strength drawn from nowhere, the ways people gave when there was nothing left to give. A woman who lost her entire family but went on to raise others, a man who never boarded another ship but spent the rest of his life advocating for safety at sea. A little girl who watched her world disappear in the cold and who, 80 years later, still cried at the sound of a violin. They lived their lives not untouched by sorrow, but shaped by it, like sea glass worn smooth by time, and their stories, passed down, gave shape to the tragedy not as a tale of doom, but of devotion, because the real legacy of Titanic was not that she sank, but that even as she did, humanity rose. People often ask, what would I have done? Would I have stayed calm? Would I have given up my seat? Would I have held someone's hand? The truth is, we never know. But Titanic gives us something rare, a glimpse of those who did. Not perfect people, not heroes carved in stone, just people choosing love in the dark, choosing sacrifice, choosing grace. Their names are not all remembered, but their actions echo, and every time someone stops to help a stranger, every time someone gives without being asked, every time a hand is reached out in the middle of fear, their spirit continues. It's there, on lifeboats and shorelines, in lullabies and lanterns, in memorials made not of marble, but of memory. They are the reason we light candles, the reason we pause, the reason we still whisper her name, not because of how she sank, but because of how they stood. There is a certain kind of silence that only comes after great loss, not empty silence, but a full one, like a room still echoing with voices that are no longer there. That's the silence Titanic left behind, not just in the waters where she rests, but in cities and hearts and histories touched by her memory. It's the hush that falls over someone reading the list of names, the quiet breath before someone steps into an exhibit filled with her relics, the stillness of a child pressing their hand against a photo of the ship, wondering how something so big could ever be gone. But the truth is, she isn't gone. Not really. Her body may rest at the bottom of the sea, her bones twisted and broken by time and pressure, but her soul, if a ship can have one, and this one surely did, floats on. It floats in the letters written by passengers just days before, the sinking, full of hope and little details. The sea is calm today. The food is splendid. I met the most charming family from France. These letters, stopped mid-journey, now carry more weight than they were ever meant to. Each one is a window into a life interrupted. And yet, in that interruption, there is something eternal. It floats in the lullabies sung to children in third class, in the laughter that once echoed down the halls, in the music that drifted from the dining saloons late into the night. All of it, every word, every note, now part of a story, retold not because it ended in sorrow, but because it was filled with love before it did. And love, real love, never ends. It simply moves forward, through people, through memories, through time. There is a story of a young man named Jack Thayer, a first-class passenger who survived by clinging to an overturned lifeboat in the freezing water. He was just 17. He watched the ship go down, watched people disappear into the darkness, and lived the rest of his life with those sights stitched into his mind. In the years after, he wrote about what he saw, not for fame, but because he needed the world to understand what had happened, and more than that, who had been lost. He spoke of the quiet, the dignity, the kindness. He never forgot the faces, and because of him, neither did we. That is how memory becomes legacy, through those who carry it, gently, not shouting, not selling, just holding it, like a candle against the wind. The Titanic's legacy is often tied to her design, her speed, her ambition. But maybe what she truly represented was something softer, a moment in time when thousands of people from different places and lives found themselves together, sharing meals, watching sunrises, worrying about trivial things, completely unaware of how deeply they would soon be connected. And it's in that connection that her story still breathes. See, history doesn't live in books. It lives in us, in the way we slow down to feel something, in the way we treat strangers on crowded roads, in the way we hold on to names that were never ours, but matter anyway. Titanic was not just a shipwreck. She was a crossing, not just of the Atlantic, but of humanity, from the illusion of control to the reality of vulnerability, from class and status to shared fate, from separation to solidarity, and in her final hours, all those lines dissolved. The richest men in the world stood beside bakers and school teachers, captains and porters and musicians and passengers, all faced the same stars, the same cold, the same questions, and in that unity, something rare happened. The world saw itself, not in steel and engines, but in sacrifice, in grace, in the small, brave ways people loved. That is why she matters still, because in remembering Titanic, we remember what it means to be human, in both our limits and our greatness. Somewhere in the gentle quiet of early morning light, when the world hasn't quite woken and the air is still thick with sleep, there's a moment, just a breath, where time feels softer, lighter. That moment is where the Titanic often returns, not in the rush of headlines or the weight of tragedy, but in that in-between space where memory is more feeling than fact, where the heart remembers what the mind cannot explain, where you don't just recall the ship, you feel her. There's a museum in a small town where one of the original lifeboats is displayed. It sits behind glass now, resting still after a journey that once saved lives. The wood is old, worn down by time, its paint peeling, its edges splintered, and yet people stop in front of it and stare. They don't just see a boat, they see the mothers who clutched their children in it, the hands that trembled on the oars, the frozen night that wrapped around it. Some visitors cry, quietly, not because of what they're looking at, but because of what they're suddenly remembering. A voice they never heard, a face they never saw, and yet they feel the loss as if it were their own. Titanic invites that kind of grief, the kind that belongs to no one and everyone, the kind that doesn't ask for understanding, only witnessing. Each lifeboat launched that night became more than wood and rope. It became a symbol of choices, of who lived, of who stayed behind. Some boats left nearly empty, not because there weren't people, but because they didn't yet believe. They thought, like so many did, that this ship could not fall, that the sea would wait, that someone, somewhere, would make it right. But the sea did not wait. It rose slowly, steadily, with a quiet determination that no one could stop. And even as the truth arrived, cold and full, there were moments of extraordinary grace. A young steward, barely more than a boy, helping a woman into a lifeboat and saying with a smile, "You'll be warm soon, ma'am," knowing he never would be. A father giving his only life jacket to his daughter and whispering, "You go, you must live for us both," and then turning away before she could argue. Two brothers who held hands until the very end found later side by side, still holding on. These are not just stories. They are acts of love etched into history, and they remind us that the soul of Titanic is not in her decks or dining halls or towering funnels. It's in the people, and those people live on, not just in graveyards or archives, but in the way we remember them, in the way we pause, in the way we reflect, in the way we choose love again and again when fear would be easier. There are monuments to Titanic all over the world. Some are tall, carved in stone, standing in parks or harbors. Others are smaller, a bench by the sea, a bell in a church tower, a name on a plaque. But the truest monuments are built inside us. Every time we ask, would I have stayed calm? Every time we wonder, could I have let go? Every time we say their names aloud, names like Wallace, Isidore, Eva, Thomas, Milvina, Jack, Madeline, we keep them here, not in sorrow, but in gratitude, because they showed us something we rarely see so clearly, that love can outlast the cold, that kindness can light up the dark, that even when everything is falling, some people will still rise. There are places in the ocean where no fish swim, where no coral grows, but not at the wreck of the Titanic. There, life has returned. Sea creatures have made homes inside her hull. Plants grow along her rails. In some strange, sacred way, the ship has become a part of the sea, not just resting in it, belonging to it, and that, too, is a kind of peace. Because maybe it means that nothing, not even a great ship sinking in the night, is ever truly lost. Maybe it just changes, transforms, becomes something else. And maybe, when we dream of her now, as so many do, we dream not of steel and sorrow, but of something more gentle, a ship floating through starlight, her lights still warm, her decks still filled with laughter, a place where no one is afraid, where the music never stops, where every goodbye is met with a new beginning. And in that dream, she sails on, not into tragedy, but into forever. And so she sails, not in the way she once did, cutting proudly through the Atlantic with her 4 towering funnels and her polished brass gleaming in the sun, but in the quiet currents of human memory, soft, vast, and endless. Titanic moves now through the hearts of people who never set foot aboard her, who weren't even born for decades after she slipped beneath the waves. Still, they carry her with them, in their voices, in their art, in their questions, in their longing. She has become more than a shipwreck. She has become a symbol of beauty, of vulnerability, of courage, of sorrow, and of something else too. Something even deeper, connection, because Titanic connects us not only to history, but to each other. She reminds us of what we all share, the same fears, the same hopes, the same desire to love and to be remembered. Her story reaches across oceans, across cultures, across generations, whispering the same message over and over. Life is fragile, but love is not. Love endures. It endured in the cold that night, when strangers wrapped their arms around one another for warmth. It endured when mothers hushed their children, not with the truth, but with comfort. It endured in the final notes of a hymn that rose above the chaos and drifted into the stars. It endures now in every soul who listens to the story with a quiet heart and a tear in their eye. Somewhere in London, an archivist turns the brittle pages of a passenger manifest, her fingertips brushing names written in ink more than a century old. She doesn't know these people, but she speaks their names aloud, gently, one at a time, because she believes that to speak a name is to keep it alive. Somewhere in Boston, a father sits beside his daughter, showing her a model of the ship. He points out the lifeboats, the dining rooms, the decks. She listens, wide-eyed. Then, softly, she asks, "Did they know it was going to sink?" And he shakes his head. "No," he says. "They thought it was the safest place in the world." Somewhere in a darkened theater, a film plays. Again, it tells the story of two fictional lovers wrapped in the very real tragedy of the Titanic. In the audience, people weep, not just for the characters, but for everyone, for all the goodbyes that were never supposed to be the last, for all the lives that ended mid-sentence. Somewhere in a small town, a woman places a single white rose beneath a plaque that bears her great-grandmother's name. She never met her, but she remembers her, and that is enough. These acts, these quiet rituals of remembrance, they are not dramatic, they don't make headlines, but they are sacred. They are what keep Titanic afloat, because for all her steel and engineering, she was always powered by people, and people, even in their ordinary moments, leave behind extraordinary echoes. In the ship's final hour, as the bow dipped lower and the stern lifted toward the stars, many passengers knew the end had come, and yet, amid the fear, there was calm. There were voices singing hymns. There were embraces. There were prayers, some spoken aloud, some only whispered inside the heart. And then there was water, and then darkness. But then there was also dawn, Carpathia, a ship that was never meant to be a part of this story, suddenly became the bearer of it. Her crew did not expect heroism that night, but they rose into it anyway. They brought blankets, they brewed tea, they held hands, they offered names, and in doing so, they began the long, slow task of holding grief. Those hours in the lifeboats, drifting on black water under endless sky, were filled with silence, and yet those who survived carried within them a light. Fragile, yes, but real. A light that has never gone out. It flickers in the pages of diaries. It glows in the paintings and the songs and the whispered stories passed down. It shines every April when bells are rung, when candles are lit, when people across the world pause to feel the ache and the awe of it all. And in that light, Titanic is not a shipwreck. She is a love letter to those who gave, to those who stayed, to those who were lost, to those who remember. She is a love letter to us all, urging us to live gently, to listen closely, to hold each other while there is still time. So if you ever stand by the sea and the wind brushes your cheek just so, if you ever look up at the stars and feel very small, but also deeply known, if you ever hold someone close and wonder how to say what words can't carry, think of her. Think of the ship that sailed once, then vanished, but never really left. Somewhere beneath 2 miles of dark water, in the cold, crushing stillness of the deep ocean, the Titanic rests, not in silence, but in remembrance. The sea around her moves slowly, a quiet sentinel that has watched her change. She is no longer the polished marvel that left Southampton, the pride of men who dreamed in steel and light. Now, she is something older, quieter, more sacred. Her bones are rusted, her windows are empty, her grand staircase, once the heartbeat of opulence, lies dissolved into silt, and yet, in that stillness, there is peace, a reverence. You don't have to see her to feel her. You don't have to know her full history to understand her meaning, because Titanic is not just a story about a ship. She's a story about us. And if we listen, really listen, we begin to hear that story not in the roar of tragedy, but in the hush between breaths, in the things people don't always say, in the glance passed between two strangers when they hear her name, in the sigh that follows, soft and full, like remembering a dream you didn't want to wake from. She lives in gestures, in a child's drawing of a ship with too many lifeboats, in a couple holding hands a little tighter after watching a documentary together, in the silence a museum guide allows to fall before telling a visitor that yes, all of them were real. We carry her, and somehow, without us realizing it, she carries us too, because her story is one of ending, but also of becoming. What was supposed to be a crossing became a legacy. What began as a journey became a testament. Titanic asks something of us. Gently, without demand, she asks us to remember that people matter more than things, that love is stronger than pride, that kindness, even in the smallest form, can be the brightest light when the world goes dark, And she asks us to hold those truths like lifeboats, to cling to them, to pass them to others, so they too can stay afloat. There's a boy sitting in a library, flipping through a book too big for his lap. He sees an old photograph of the ship with people waving from the deck, smiles frozen in black and white. He doesn't know their names, but he stares. Something about it feels important. Later, he tells his mother he wants to learn more. He doesn't know yet that he'll carry this story his whole life, that one day he'll write about her, talk about her, hold her in his heart like a quiet fire. There's a woman who visits the Belfast shipyard once a year. She walks the outline where Titanic once stood, her eyes scanning the massive dock, now quiet. She's not related to anyone who sailed, but she feels close to them all. She walks the perimeter slowly, whispering thank you into the wind, not knowing exactly who she's thanking, just knowing she must. There's a diver who, for the first time, sees her with his own eyes in the dark, blue depths, with only his light cutting through the shadows. He sees the railing, the broken mast, the collapsed walls, and suddenly, the wreck is not just history, it's a cathedral, a place to lower your voice, to feel something larger than yourself. And even though he trained for years for this moment, he cries, not because of fear, but because of awe, because somewhere in that ruined, rusted ship, he feels the presence of every life she ever carried. And above him, the ocean moves gently, like breath. The sea does not judge. It does not forget. It holds everything, the proud, the broken, the lost. And somewhere in that infinite, sacred silence, Titanic is still sailing, not through water, but through time, and her course is steady. Each year, more people learn her story. Each year, someone speaks her name for the first time, and something stirs in them, a need to know, to remember, to honor. And so she sails on, carried by memory, by wonder, by love, not unsinkable, but unforgettable. Let us drift now, slowly and softly, to the final stretch of this long voyage, not to an end, but to a resting place, a place where memory settles gently, like snow on an open field, where the tide pulls in only whispers, and the wind speaks only in lullabies. The Titanic, once so loud in the world, in headlines, in courtrooms, in cinema, is quiet here, not forgotten, not silenced, just quiet, at peace. Because when the noise fades, what remains is the truth, not the myths, not the spectacle, but the truth. That 2,108 people boarded a ship with plans and dreams and flaws and fears, and only 706 returned. That for every name listed in a memorial book, there was a mother who waited, a father who hoped, a friend who never stopped searching, that the Atlantic is not just water now. It is a graveyard. It is a shrine, and yet not a place of despair. The sea did not swallow only tragedy. It became a keeper of stories, and those stories, against all odds, grew louder with time, not by shouting, but by being whispered from person to person. And now you carry them, too, not because you chose to, but because something in them chose you. Maybe it was the music, or the final letter written, or the kindness of a stranger with no reason to be kind. Or maybe it was simply the idea that people, when stripped of title and wealth and all illusion, will still reach for each other in the dark. There is something deeply human in that Titanic reminds us that we are not invincible, but she also reminds us that we don't need to be, that our strength does not lie in what we build, but in how we care. That legacy is not made in steel, but in compassion. There's a place in New York where an old newspaper is framed behind glass. The headline reads, "Titanic lost with 1,500 aboard." It hangs in silence. Below it, flowers are sometimes left, fresh ones. After all this time, no ceremony, no press. Just a quiet gesture from someone passing by. They do not stay to explain. They leave the flower and go because they know. And that is enough. In another corner of the world, a little girl is tucked into bed by her grandfather. She asks for one more story. He tells her of a ship, a beautiful ship, one that carried people across the sea. He doesn't tell her everything, not yet, but he tells her this, that on that ship, when everything went wrong, many people were brave, many people were kind, and even though the ship did not reach its destination, the love aboard her still did. She smiles. She asks, "Did they become stars?" He nods. "Some of them, I think, did." And as she falls asleep, the story takes root in her. Small, glowing, soft. This is how Titanic continues. Through gestures, through telling, through feeling, not frozen in the past, but sailing on, steady and full of grace, into every heart that opens to her. You have walked with her now, through the sunlit decks and the cold night air, through the laughter and the fear, through the stillness of the sea and the rising of the dawn. You've heard her music, seen her lights, stood among her people, and now you may rest, because the journey has not ended. It has simply come home. Close your eyes. Let the waves carry you. Let the stars watch over you. Let every heartbeat of that long ago night become a lullaby. Now you are safe, you are warm, and the story, their story, lives on in you. Sleep gently now. Titanic sails on. Somewhere in the world tonight, a light is left on. In a small room, in a quiet house, Someone has fallen asleep with a book resting on their chest, pages open to a story about a ship that sailed more than 100 years ago. The story was not new to them, but it never feels old. They've read it many times, and still it calls. There is something about the Titanic that keeps reaching out. Something unspoken, something unfinished, and maybe that's why we return to her. Because no matter how often we tell the story, it never truly ends. It just keeps opening. There is a tenderness in the way the world still speaks her name. Not the way it does with disasters, but the way it does with love. Titanic, a name once shouted in pride, now spoken like a prayer. She is part of our shared language, though few of us have ever seen her resting place. She belongs to no country, no single people. She belongs to all who remember. There's a replica of her grand staircase somewhere, built not in the ocean, but in a hotel. People climb its steps carefully, whispering, even though there are no signs asking them to be quiet. They touch the banisters, close their eyes. Some wear dresses and tuxedos to relive the magic. Others come in silence, dressed in everyday clothes, carrying nothing but reverence. They stand at the top of the staircase and look down, imagining the sound of music rising from the saloon below, the hum of conversation, the rustle of dresses, the weight of time turning backward for just a moment, because that's what Titanic gives us. Not just loss, but time, a glimpse into a moment when the world felt different, when the greatest danger most passengers feared was missing breakfast or embarrassing themselves at dinner. No one thought that night would come, and because of that, it lives forever. The world learned many lessons after Titanic about lifeboats, about safety drills, about wireless signals, and radio operators, and iceberg warnings. Those things matter. They saved lives in later years. But those lessons, while important, were not the deepest ones. The deepest ones live in the human spirit. They live in the decisions made that night, not by nations or companies or captains, but by people. Woman helping an elderly man into a lifeboat she was told to board first. A third-class passenger lifting his child onto a ladder before turning away. Not because he gave up, but because he knew what mattered most. A steward offering his only coat to a stranger who had lost theirs. A band leader who nodded to his fellow musicians and began to play. Not because it would change the outcome, but because it would change how people faced it. The ship was built in greatness, but she was remembered in grace. And that grace lives on, not in museums alone, or in books, or in the depths of the Atlantic, but in the gentle way the story is passed on. A teacher telling a student, a mother reading a bedtime book, a tour guide pointing out a photo with reverence in their voice, a child placing a flower at a memorial without fully knowing why, only that it feels right. We don't need to understand the Titanic to feel her. We just need to be still and listen. Now, imagine this. Imagine the wreck, not as it is, but as it was. Not as rust and ruin, but as a living ship once more. A heartbeat, a home, a place where people smiled and danced and ate and dreamed. Imagine walking her decks at twilight, the lanterns flickering gold in the wind, the sky a blanket of stars. So close, it feels like you could reach up and press your hand into the constellations. You hear the soft clink of dishes from the dining saloon, laughter from behind a closed door, a child's footsteps as she runs ahead of her parents, her curls bouncing with every joyful step, the hum of the engines far below, like the pulse of something alive. You don't see tragedy here. You see life. You see the moments before, the ones so often forgotten because they didn't make headlines, but they mattered. They were real. And for so many, they were the last. A final meal with a friend, a shared story on the promenade, a letter written by candlelight and sealed with hope. Titanic was filled with these moments, and that is what she became. A collection of last things, last words, last songs, last embraces, but in becoming that, she taught us something few stories can, that it's the ordinary that becomes holy, that the quiet matters more than we ever knew, that kindness in the small hours, that comfort in a stranger's voice, that choice to give when you have little, that is legacy. So maybe the most important thing about Titanic is not the ship, not the size, not the iceberg, but the people, people who lived full, aching, breathtaking lives inside a few hours. People who stood in the cold and made choices so full of love that we still feel them. People who have become something more than memory. They have become part of us. When we are brave, when we are selfless, when we are kind, we carry them forward. We are their lifeboats now, and we are their legacy. Let us now bring this long, quiet journey to a place of stillness, not to close the story, but to let it rest beside you like a soft blanket pulled gently to the chin. Titanic has carried us far, across oceans, across time, across emotion, and now, as the stars begin to settle and the sea grows even more hushed than before, we arrive at the place where stories are no longer told, only felt. There is no more rush, no more needing to understand, only a breath, and then another. This final breath is not an end. It is a thank you, a moment to simply hold the weight of what this journey has meant and let it lighten, for the Titanic's story does not ask to be carried with sadness. It asks to be carried with care, with gentleness, with the reverence you give to something sacred, because that's what it has become, a sacred story of steel and salt and time, of loss, yes, but of love, because love was the thread through every corridor of that ship, through every letter left unfinished, every song played as the decks tilted, every glance exchanged in those final minutes when words were no longer enough, every sacrifice, every hand held, every final goodbye whispered against the wind that love did not sink, it rose. It has lived in the silence after, in the lullabies, and in the hearts of those who came next. And now, in this moment, it lives in you. You have heard the story. You have walked the length of it with soft feet and open hands. You have listened not just to the facts, but to the echoes, to the heartbeat beneath the tragedy, to the tenderness that never left. And so, now, all that remains is to rest, to lie back in the softness of knowing, to feel the slow drift of peace come over you, like calm waters returning after a storm. The ship is quiet now. The stars are high above, shimmering like they did on that April night. The sea is wide, endless, and still, and the people, those thousands of souls, are not gone. They are here, gently folded into the folds of time, wrapped in memory, kept in story, held in hearts, every name remembered, every choice honored. Let your eyes close. Let the night take your weight. Let the story hold you as you held it. You are safe now. You are warm, and in this quiet ocean of dreams, Titanic sails on.